many years ago now, but has always stuck with me, and it's not unique. But a situation in which we had a student who had been long-term suspended, an African-American student who had been long-term suspended for continued violations of Rule 8. And upon review, it turns out that it was 14 referrals to the office and a principal who wanted to be supportive of the teacher. Upon further review, it turned out that this student also was a straight A student except for a B in that class, which was focused on because there were referrals. It further turned out that the number of referrals from that particular teacher, who was a brand new teacher, was extraordinarily disproportionately high compared to any other teacher in the school. And this kid was now facing a greater than excess of 10-day out-of-school suspension. And the problem was, as it turned out, and as there had been a lack of focus until it got way down the road, was the teacher who was a first-year teacher, did not have classroom management skills that were of the type and nature that made that teacher fully appropriate for helping our students. But the price that was about to be paid was for a student who, not only graduated from our schools with the highest of honors, but has gone on to the highest of honors in a four-year university. And I say that story only to say our educators are wonderful, but classroom management is a tough and difficult skill that not all of our educators have to the same degree that others do, and certainly on our youngest educators, it's a genuine challenge for some. And it's an area where, with the challenges that our higher institutions of higher learning in the area of education are having, it's not necessarily one that's being imparted with the same level of urgency and need that's important to the process. And so that's one thing I think we need to continue to look at and be supportive of our institutions of higher learning in terms of this is a critical issue and a critical component for learning across all students. The second point I'd make, and this is supportive of points that several people have made, the data makes it clear that there is a disparity or disproportionality in punishment. That is simply not a debatable point. I know some people want to debate it, but when you have the exact same offense and significantly disproportionate punishments, the data makes it clear there's a disproportionality. How we address that speaks to who we are. And so we first need to make clear where our data is. We also need to find out if we're closing that gap or changing that picture at all as a district. It should be important to all of us that we are. The third point, and this goes to the broader one, and this is a more difficult point, and I think Amos has lifted it up to some degree already, which is, as somebody said, it's great that we are lowering our numbers of total suspensions. But it's only great if that's because we're having less conduct that warrants disciplinary actions. That's not great if we've lowered the number and we're simply overlooking or leaving no consequence for inappropriate behavior, because what that ultimately means is a loss of discipline, a loss of accountability, and unfortunately that creates an atmosphere for students, regardless of color, that creates a lack of respect. And I think that's a key word, and Eric, you used it just a minute ago, is critical to this process. If we're going to resolve these issues, and I think it's very important because this moves to the most important one, we cannot continue to have 85% of our students be African American, both male and female. And I agree with somebody who said earlier tonight, the rise in female numbers is alarming. I think Dina said that, used that very word, and she's extremely correct about that. We have to change the dynamic of respect in terms of how we deal with these relationships. That is a two-way street. Obviously, we expect respect from our younger people towards adults, but I think we've often heard the expression, to have that respect in some degree, you also earn it with the way you treat the young adults. And most of our educators are fabulous at that, or other people in our school system, but we need to create an atmosphere of mutual respect. That's a huge challenge, but it will go a long way towards resolving a lot of issues. If we can truly create and show that we have significantly reduced numbers and we're changing the proportionality of it, and show it in a way that's meaningful, in an accountable way, we will bring our community together. Because our African American community feels picked upon, to lack of a better term, in terms of what's happening with their children in the schools in terms of these numbers. And I think there's justification for that belief based on the disproportionality we've talked about. We have a number of people in our community, people not of color, who believe, sometimes based on something they've seen or experienced, or sometimes just based on what they hear. It's a more generalized belief. It's not necessarily factual or fully accurate, but it's one that they nonetheless hold very dear and close to their heart, which is that there is a lack of control in terms of some of the numbers, and if there's a lowering of the numbers, they believe it's simply because the rules aren't being enforced. There's a cultural disconnect. If we can bring together that cultural disconnect, I think we go a long way towards resolving a whole lot of issues. But we have to do it honestly and transparently, and it's got to be real. It cannot be contrived, and that's our true challenge. How do we get to that place? Because none of us benefit by the concerns that we have in our community that are different in nature. They're not identical, and we all know that because we've all heard them from different constituents and different people in the community. So in addition to develop and respect, I would submit that 2 or 3 things that we have talked about that have some value is PBIS in some schools, when put in with fidelity, has yielded some positive results. It won't work if we don't commit to it and if it's not put in with fidelity and there's not a commitment on staff. So I don't put it out there as a panacea. On the other hand, I know that in some schools it's been extremely effective, and teachers, students, and parents would all say this has been a good thing. In other schools, I understand that's not the case. Restorative justice, I think, is an initiative that's something that we have to look at in a way that involves our students, but has a clear promise for greater understanding and respect if implemented correctly and with fidelity. And I think almost every one of these won't work if they're not implemented with fidelity and a sense of commitment. The third one is youth courts showed an awful lot of promise. When somebody has to answer to their peers for what they've done in a meaningful way, that seems to have a positive effect on a lot of students. It then goes back out to the respect issue. And none of these are a magic answer. None of them are. And then the other thing is the layered discipline approach that, Eric, you referred to again a few moments ago in your remarks. The layered discipline approach is something that's got a lot of promise. There's been a lot of discussion about that in some of the educational literature in more recent times because people are concerned about these issues. Again, implementation with fairness and even-handedness is a tremendous challenge, but it's got positive potential in terms of moving people forward in a way that there's a mutuality of the process. It's not just a one-sided process. There's commitments and accountability on both sides, and so that's got a benefit. So these are just observations. Don't pretend any of them are particularly meaningful even, but I do think they're all important in the long term in terms of how we can change our dynamic. This is such an extraordinarily important issue for us because it's something that can bring us together, and in some ways right now it's not fully bringing us together. And yet I look at these kids, and I know some of these kids, and they're fabulous, and they do great things, and yet we don't, we sometimes lost in this is the real promise and the real fulfillment of promise of so many of these students. So this is a place where we can change that dynamic for all of our community. So now's the time. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I consider this extraordinarily important work, and I look forward to hearing next from you in October. And I know the rest of our board does as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
One last procedural question.